Hello, I'm Marcus Krieger of the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, and this is a story made to wish Concordia Lutheran Church a happy 150th birthday. It's a story about perhaps the most important work of art made by perhaps my favorite artist, Orabel Thortvedt, who was born in 1896 and lived until 1983. She went to this church. And her Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane altar painting at Concordia Lutheran Church in Mullen Township, just a little northwest of Glyndon, Minnesota, was a milestone in her life. The story of this painting is preserved in the family diaries and collected letters and photographs that we call the Thortvedt Family Papers collection in the Clay County Archives. It's a story about Norwegian pioneers building a church, a tornado that destroyed it, and the artist's life coming to a crossroads. And all the paintings and drawings that illustrate this video were made by Orabel Thortvedt, and the photos either come from the Thortvedt Family Papers or from Concordia Lutheran Church itself. Concordia Lutheran Church has roots in some of the earliest settlers of Clay County, Minnesota. The church sits on the bank of the Buffalo River, not far from where it flows into the Red River of the North. And this is an interesting place. Since it's on the north side of the river, the north bank of the Buffalo River, it was part of the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe people, and the land came into the United States of America in the 1855 Treaty of Washington with the Pillager Ojibwe and the Mississippi Ojibwe. The opposite bank of the river, the south side, was the land of the Wahpeton and Sisseton Dakota, and that came into the USA in the 1851 Traverse de Sioux Treaty. But it took a while for the USA to get here. The Civil War and the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 put a pause on westward expansion into the Red River frontier. And when the Buffalo River settlers made their homes here in 1870, they had very few neighbors on that rugged edge of U.S. settlement. The overwhelming majority of the population of Clay County in 1870 were Métis, so an indigenous people of the Red River Valley. The Buffalo River settlers, though, came from Houston County in the southeast corner of Minnesota. But most of these interrelated families had recently immigrated from Telemark, Norway. In 1870, a group of 3 families and 5 single men, led by Ola Thortvedt, Orabel's grandfather, sought better land in the Red River Valley. Orabel's father, Levi, was 9 years old on the wagon trip across Minnesota's prairie. Each settler family was a magnet for another family, and year by year, sisters and brothers and cousins and best friends from the old country all reunited in Minnesota. The settlers built houses and turned the tall grass prairie into farmland. The next year, 1871, the railroad came through and built a line of towns just south of them: Detroit Lakes, Hawley, Glyndon, Moorhead, Fargo, and on west. West central Minnesota started filling up with farmers. Here's a photograph of the Thortvedt family. In the middle of the photo is her father, Levi Thortvedt, and just to the right, just to his right is Ingeborg Thortvedt, his wife, Orabel's mother. Orabel is to the left of her dad, the precocious-looking kid with wide eyes, maybe about 10 years old, looking right at you. Orabel caught a childhood illness, which she survived, but left her almost totally deaf for the rest of her life. She adored animals, especially horses and cats. Next to her is her grandpa Ola Thortvedt, her hero, the old Norwegian pioneer. Everybody else in the photo are sisters and brothers. And they were a very close family, a very loving family. You'd like them. They were farmers. And it wasn't long after they built their homes in the Buffalo River that the Norwegian immigrant families organized churches. Lutheran churches. A Mullen congregation was formed in 1872, and the Thortvedts helped establish the Our Savior's congregation in 1874. The first service for Our Savior's was held at Tarjei Grover's house, in the Norwegian language, of course. and then moved to area schoolhouses before a church building was erected in 1884. In 1892, Our Savior's and Molen congregations merged to form Concordia Lutheran Church. According to the church records, written in Norwegian, of course, in the spring of 1894, at the council meeting, the church council authorized Pastor Ostedal and Mr. Jensen to ask around for a painter so they could order an altar painting that would be fitting for the church and ready next summer. Pastor Ostedal and Mr. Jensen chose C. Ludwig Bachmann of St. Paul for the job. C. Ludwig Bachmann was listed in St. Paul's 1895 city directory as one of about 40 artists working in the city, specializing in oil and watercolor portrait paintings. The scene Mr. Bachmann painted, here on the left, was Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a very familiar image to anybody who has set foot in a church over the last 130 years. Jesus kneels in prayer at the top of a rocky hill, looking sadly to the sky, waiting for Judas to arrive with Roman soldiers who would take him to torture and crucifixion. Mr. Bachmann did not come up with the image himself. It was a copy of a painting made by German artist Heinrich Hoffmann in 1890, here on the right. The 1890s was the time of Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, and Edvard Munch in the art world. But although few people remember the name Heinrich Hoffmann, his religious paintings are some of the most recognizable scenes in Western culture. He was a Dresden art teacher, and his Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane was copied over and over again to hang in churches or illustrate Bibles, adapted into stained glass windows and religious knickknacks. And as we can see, this painting was copied for an altarpiece in rural Minnesota just 4 years after the original painting was painted in Germany. C. Ludwig Bachmann's version of Gethsemane was hung over the altar at Concordia Lutheran Church until May 27, 1931. That's when the church was totally destroyed by a tornado. Sifting through the rubble, the painting was found. In the words of Orabel, it was rent asunder from top to bottom. It was torn. It was brought to Orabel to repair. Why did they bring it to Orabel? Because she had just come home from Minneapolis after her first year of art school. At age 35, Orabel was what we now call a non-traditional student. She went to Minneapolis initially on a scholarship to take lip-reading classes. Again, Orabel was deaf. But she was always a gifted artist even as a kid, and she also landed a scholarship to go to Minneapolis Institute of Art School. She taped the painting front and back where it ripped, and then she painted over the tape on the image side. I did my best, she wrote in a 1968 letter to Reverend Joseph Vold about the painting. After fixing the original altar painting, Orabel made her own copy. On the left, Orabel is with the original, and on the right, that's her own copy. She said that, "When it was finished, I could not resist the rare chance to make a smaller copy of this painting so dear to our hearts." Orabel was given $25 from the Ladies' Aid to thank her for fixing the altar painting, but the painting would stay on the second floor of the Thortvedt house for another 5 years. There was no church to take it to. It took a long time to rebuild Concordia Lutheran Church. To say the Great Depression hit farmers hard is an understatement. In a 1973 interview, Oakport farmer Ray Gazelle, who was farming just a few miles away from the Thortvedt, said, "It didn't make any difference how hard you worked or what you did. You couldn't come out even." While much of America experienced an economic boom during the Roaring '20s, American farmers started their Great Depression a decade earlier than everybody else. For 20 years, prices for grain, vegetables, and meat were too low for farmers to make a living. Levi Thortvedt struggled to send his daughter Orabel to college, first to the Minneapolis Institute of Art from 1930 to 32, and then to the University of Minnesota from 32 to 34. In his diary entry for September 18, 1933, Levi wrote, Orabel told me she would leave for Minneapolis next Saturday. This was sad news to me. It will be long and weary months for me. We had a long and good talk. I much regret my pitiful financial conditions. I would have liked awful well to aid her financially, but my money, all that I have worked for during my whole life, has gone to make millionaires and billionaires. The Concordia congregation went to other churches for a few years while they saved up to build a new building. Meanwhile, Orabel went back to Minneapolis, where she found success. All her life, Orabel had a deep love of animals, especially horses and dogs and cats. This love and attention translated into her art, allowing her to capture an animal's personality with a paintbrush or pastels. She came to the attention of an influential and wealthy member of Twin Cities high society, Mary Saunders Bulkley. Mary and her husband Kenneth were both dog breeders, and they were well connected to both the animal breeding circles and the art world. Mrs. Bulkley was known for being one of the Twin Cities' most the highest hostesses, and she held a fancy tea party in her home to introduce Orabel Thortvedt to her friends. One of the friends there that day was Clement Halpers. Clement Halpers was an artist and a kingmaker in Minnesota's Depression-era art scene. Halpers asked Orabel to be one of 12 Minnesota artists to have their own display at the 1934 Minnesota State Fair, the biggest art show in the state. Orabel was kept busy painting the show dogs and horses of Minnesota's upper crust, and her patrons included a former candidate for governor and the heir to the Hamm's beer fortune. Then came October, 1936. Here we have portraits of Orabel's mother and father. Orabel and her sister Flo, roommates in Minneapolis, were called home because their mother needed surgery. She came out of the operation, but she did not recover, and on October 6th, Ingeborg Thortvedt died with her children at her bedside. Her body was brought home for the visitation. Orabel's painting of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane hung in the southwest corner of the room. In her tear-jerking account of her mother's death from the 1934 to 1937 Thortvedt family diary, Orabel wrote, "It was a hard day for Dad. When he hobbled painfully on his crutches to the coffin to take his first look at his sweetheart and wife, dry sobs racked his frame. It was a love match. Mama confided to us daughters that Papa was the only one she cared for. They had their ups and downs in their marital life, but love did not die on either side. And Dad paid Mother the biggest compliment any person can pay another, and that is to die of grief for her." Orabel said goodbye to her father for the last time on October 13th as she and Flo returned to Minneapolis. Orabel went back to work. She was doing this ink drawing of 2 Pekingese dogs when her roommate, Florence Gurley Junk, tapped her on the shoulder, on the verge of tears. The phone had rung, but Orabel, obviously, didn't hear it. Orabel scrambled for her hearing aid. "Is it Papa?" Orabel asked. The old pioneer was not expected to live through the night. Orabel frantically packed her bags and borrowed $4 for cab fare and a ticket home. Orabel Thortvedt was at a crossroads in her life. Stay in Minneapolis and continue her artistic career, or go home to the farm and the family. Just before her father died, she put all of her money into art supplies, a sign that she fully intended to continue in Minneapolis as a working artist until she lost both of her parents within 3 weeks. If she agonized over the decision to return home, she didn't write about it in any accounts that we've come across in the archives. Orabel took over Levi Thortvedt's duties of writing in the family diary every day and keeping the family stories. Orabel tried to continue working as an artist on the farm. While it's very difficult to make it as a living as an artist in Minneapolis at this time, it was all but impossible to make it as a working artist in 1930s Fargo-Moorhead area. She found a few patrons, most importantly Helen and W. Wallwork. Helen was an active member in the Fargo's Fine Arts Club, a former president, and her husband owned show horses and race horses, which is ironic considering that he was one of the area's early car salesmen, so he was responsible for taking a lot of those horses off the roads. On the right is a pastel of the Wallworks horse Sundial, and in the photo of W. Wallwork you can see a different horse portrait hanging on the wall behind him. At this time, Orabel worked on this portrait of her grandfather, Orabel Thortvedt, in her attic studio. Orabel also at this time was doing some illustrations for a book, and she submitted 2 short stories to magazines, but nothing was published. Meanwhile, Concordia Lutheran Church was rising from the rubble. On November 12, 1936, less than 2 weeks after her father died, the Thortvedt house, shown in this painting, received visitors. She wrote in the diary, "At noon, Reverend Runsvold and Mr. Swanson came to get measurements of Gethsemane, the old painting that I had restored after it had been ravaged by the tornado." The two came for the repaired 1894 Bachmann painting, but then they saw Orabel's copy of it, and the two left intent on convincing the congregation to choose Orabel's version of the scene instead. Orabel wrote, "There will be a meeting on next Monday in which Reverend Runsvold will put it to a vote to see if the congregation will want my painting as altarpiece, and the old one to be put down in the Sunday school room. I would indeed be honored if my picture is chosen. One of my cherished dreams come true." November 18th was a good day for Orabel, although she and her sister Stella had to pluck 4 roosters for dinner. Her brother Goodwin went to town and bought a large sack of sugar for the first time in 10 years. Orabel made lefse. That evening, her Aunt Thona Lee and her daughters Signa and Selma Lee came for dinner. They brought good news. Orabel's painting was chosen to be the new altarpiece. She donated the painting to the church in memory of her parents, Levi and Ingeborg Thortvedt. On a nice 30-degree day on December 15th, Orabel, her sister Dora, and cousins Signa and Selma Lee brought the repaired 1894 Bachmann version of the painting to the church to be put in the Sunday school room. Cousin Lenora Lee Grover brought sandwiches. She wrote, "As the church darkened, we finished. Again, the old painting has its old place of honor, and I was glad to see that it looks okay after being fixed by me 5 years ago." Orabel and Dora visited their parents in the cemetery there. She wrote, It is heavy to approach 2 cold mounds of clay, below which we know our beloved parents lie in sleep eternal. I also stopped by the graves of Ted Berg. That Ted was Dora Thortvedt's husband, who died after only 3 years of marriage. Grandpa, Grandma, and great-grandmother Joran Gjetsta. Dora would join them 5 years later, stricken down by encephalitis at age 51. When the altar finally came at the end of January, Orabel loaded the painting onto a sleigh to be taken to the church. She wrote that, "Obert and Andrew Gunderson took my painting and put it in the new altar. They said it looked nicer than the old one, but it shined from the center aisles, otherwise looked okay from the pews and gallery. We were worried about this shine. I think it's the light from the gallery windows. I should not have applied the copal varnish." Orabel was always too modest. Now, more than 85 years later, her painting is still hanging above the altar, and it looks great. We have a photograph of Orabel here in later years, standing next to the painting, and a more close-up view of what it looks like today. For the rest of her life, Orabel continued to paint animals for friends and patrons, but she devoted more and more of her time to the study of local history after she returned to the farm. Orabel spent her days studying history and compiling her findings in scrapbooks and journals and notebooks, which she indexed by subject title. She became recognized as the most knowledgeable historian of the Buffalo River settlement and the families who settled there. She wrote articles for local newspapers on historic subjects, and she worked on projects with other local historians. Orabel used her art to bring history alive, painting scenes from the past with the scholar's attention to historical detail. Her attic artist studio was preserved by the family for decades after her death in 1983. Orabel's niece, Eva Hedstrom, recalled, "She filed and cataloged hundreds of old film boxes with her clippings, 165A oxen and covered wagons, 385 women's hairstyles, 487 men in hats, etc." Orabel's passion for art and history were fused. She used her art to illustrate history, and she used history as an inspiration for her art. In addition to gathering an archive of information, she wanted to share her findings. Visitors would learn about their ancestors by looking up their families in her notebooks. Schools would arrange field trips to her house so Orabel could teach the children about local history. And on one occasion, she went to a local school to demonstrate how artists paint portraits. Young Eileen Olson posed as Orabel's model that day. Then Eileen remembered that Orabel painted the altarpiece at her church. Eileen asked, "When did Jesus pose for Orabel?"